I know that today, probably the best-selling comic book, let's just say it's Batman, sells around 95 to 100,000. What were the sales like on Transformers back in those days, in the 80s?
Well, like I said, Transformers wasn't expected to be a big hit series, which is why it was initially planned as a mini-series. But the mini-series was selling, I don't know, 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 copies an issue. So when I took it over as the writer with issue 5, we were selling in the 300,000s. As the years went on, it dwindled, but even when I got off the book, I think it was still selling over 100,000. And one thing I didn't get into was I didn't only do Transformers for Marvel. I drew Ghost Rider for a while. After Transformers, I created a character called Sleepwalker, which became its own comic book for about almost 3 years at Marvel. I oversaw the sets of trading cards that came out in the 1990s. I edited a lot of different books. I did a lot of different things over the years. So when you ask about sales figures, sales for a typical Marvel mainstream comic book, that is a Marvel Universe comic book, not a creator-owned Epic comic or some other side universe comic that wasn't part of the Marvel Universe. A typical Marvel comic book sold at least 100,000 copies in the time when I worked there, which was between 76 and 96. And a lot of them sold a lot better than that. When I was working on Ghost Rider, I started drawing Ghost Rider covers with, I think, issue, I don't know, 29 or 33 or something. I took over drawing the interiors with issue 68, and then it got canceled with issue 81. So I was on the book when it got canceled, issue 81, because sales had dropped to 105,000.
Which is better than anything selling today.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah, and at that time, Jim Shooter had decided to cancel Marvel's lowest selling title so he can make room on the shelves for new books that he wanted to publish. So Ghost Rider was one of those books that got hit. But, it made sense. The books were only selling 105,000. So at that time, that was a low-selling book.
So before you had taken over writing of Transformers, you had plotted some stories, but you hadn't done much writing for Marvel, at least, right? Other than plotting. Am I right about that?
Right.
Okay.
I co-plotted a bunch of Ghost Rider stories with Mark DeMatteis. When I was the artist on the book, I had co-plotted a couple of Avengers stories. Really, that was about it.
Well, the thing is, I love your stuff, and I know I can read it over and over again. And one of the things I noticed is that you really like to play against the audience's expectations. Like, for example, making Ratbat the leader of the Decepticons at one point, which was, a totally unexpected choice. And then before that, you had Shockwave replace Megatron as the leader of the Decepticons. Whereas with the people familiar with the cartoon, we always think of Megatron as just being this invincible, leader. In the comic, Shockwave was more logical, more calculating, and he ended up taking over the leadership of the Decepticons. Was that a calculated move by you to just go against audiences' expectations, or was it just something you just thought, oh, well, I'll try this?
Well, I think there were a couple of factors. One, I think you're right about, as a writer, I'm always trying to come up with something to surprise the audience, like not to do the expected. The other thing, though, was again, what I mentioned earlier, was that Hasbro kept introducing new waves of toys that had to be introduced into the comic book. So I had to find ways to move out of the limelight, of the spotlight, these main characters to introduce other characters. So I found all sorts of excuses or reasons or whatever. For a while I killed off Optimus Prime, figuring, well, he's a robot, he can always come back. One time Megatron lost his memory and just became like a super gun for a common criminal. And just to play around with what people, here's this super powerful robot, living robot, who all of a sudden gets knocked down to just being somebody's handgun. So I just wanted to find ways to play with people's expectations and hopefully surprise them in good ways.
Well, and I want to point out, I think one of the things about Optimus's character is you did have the story in the comic when Optimus died. It was because the Autobots and the Decepticons had entered into a virtual reality. And one of the points was that whoever died in the game had to be killed in real life. The leader of the team that died in the game had to be killed. Now what ends up happening is the Autobots win, but Optimus basically reveals that they cheated. So he feels like, you know what, we cheated, and so therefore we didn't actually win, so you have to kill me. So he basically sacrifices himself, right? Is that what happened?
Well, you're asking me to think about all the details of a story that you've read many times
that
I wrote 35 years ago, so I don't remember exactly. It sounds good.
I just reread it again last summer, so
all I remember,
it's fresh in my mind.
The thing that I remember most about it is that my nephew killed him. So there was the character who was the master of the video game was Ethan Zachary.
Yes.
So my nephew Ethan Zachary Budiansky.
Wow.
So he likes to brag that he killed Optimus Prime. He still does to this day.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Well, I think that's what you brought to the characters. Like, let's be clear, these were robots, but they were living, they were alive, right?
Yes. Oh, definitely. Yes.
They were alive. They had personalities, and I think that's why there's been robots before then, robots after, but I think that's why people are so attached to them, because of the personalities that you gave them. That's at least what I think.
I hope so. I mean, I felt like in order to relate to these characters, even though they're aliens and they're completely different forms than we are, you had to understand where they were coming from. And in order to do that, they had to have emotions like something that we could connect to. The thing that really kept me going on the Transformers as a writer, though, was that there was a difference between these alien robotic life forms and humans. And so basically the Transformers, to my mind, overall was like basically a fish out of water story. You have these super powerful aliens plop down in the middle of Earth. How do they deal with us? How do we deal with them? Sometimes we cooperate, sometimes we come to blows against each other, sometimes they try to understand us, sometimes they don't care what we think. So all of these things entered into all the stories that I was writing. Although, just to kind of like undercut everything I just said, I mentioned earlier that my favorite story was a smelting pool story. All of that takes place on Cybertron. There are no humans in it.
True.
But,
okay, so I would like to open it up to questions. Does anyone have any questions for Bob?
yeah, and also I'll mention, we talked a lot about Transformers. I'm kind of tired of talking about Transformers, although I will continue to talk about it if you ask me questions. But I'll be happy to talk about any other facet of my Marvel career. Yes.
Can you just touch on your time working on SpiderMan?
Okay, so at the end of my Marvel career, Marvel was going through a lot of changes in the 90s, and among the changes was that the Marvel editor-in-chief office or position was divided into 5 different positions. So I was at that time an executive editor, and Marvel chose me, the president of the company chose me to become the Spider-Man editor-in-chief. So I became the editor-in-chief of Spider-Man from around October 94 through January 96. And so during that time, I was responsible for all the Spider-Man books, all the books in the Spider-Man universe, like Venom and whoever else was Spider-Man related at that time.
So were you already on the book when McFarlane came on? Or?
No, McFarlane had already left. By 94, he'd been gone a couple of years already.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I had walked in, I don't like to talk about this chapter of my career so much because I walked into the middle of the clone saga. And so certain things were already underway, and I had to do my best to make lemonade out of lemons. And I don't think I've completely succeeded either. So anyway, that was my time on Spider-Man. But actually, during that time, Marvel was imploding. Marvel soon went into bankruptcy in 1997. So Marvel was going through waves and waves of layoffs, staff layoffs, like hundreds of people, and books were being canceled. But while I was Spider-Man editor-in-chief, we actually made budget, which was remarkable because so many books were just falling off the cliff. Yes?
Kind of 2 questions, actually. But, do you have any claim in the IDW, due to the fact that IDW has the rights to Transformers right now, do you get any of that royalty, or does any of that carry over?
That's an interesting and painful question at the same time. So when Marvel reprints any of my work, they send a very modest royalty check. But it's nice that they have a plan to compensate people if they reprint their work. But once Marvel releases a licensed book to some other publisher, that's the end of it. So over the years, IDW has sent me free copies of books that they reprint, which is very nice of them. I did one book for IDW, a little mini-series, an adaptation of the animated series. They redid their version of it, and they hired me to write it back about 10 years ago. So I understand that. Simon Furman, who I mentioned earlier, has been involved in lots of reprints with Titan Books over in England of Transformers work. I constantly send him like all sorts of little goodies to add to his, like some of those sketches you saw and things, to give him some extra things to throw into his reprints. And what I get back from him is when I see him at a convention, he buys me a beer.
So I don't mean to piggyback, but do you have any good Ike Perlmutter stories?
I never interacted with Ike Perlmutter, so no, I don't. And I think from what I understand, I'm lucky I never interacted with him.
Yes. George?
When you were talking earlier about special projects editor, I've just seen so many weird things from Marvel over the years that they sent to fans, or even, wacky stickers or mini books if you notice a mistake or anything like that. Was that, at that time period, had they already gone through that phase? Were there any interesting projects that were thrown your way that were maybe creatively interesting?
The special projects editor job evolved because in the 1980s, Marvel was getting so many inquiries from other companies to produce comic books or to develop something. So Jim Shooter recognized in me like somebody who he thought could be a good focus for that. So when movie studios came to us to do movie adaptations, when toy companies came to us to make their toys into comic books, but I didn't only work on Transformers, I worked on forgotten toys like Visionaries and Sectors and Air Raiders.
Well, that's what I'm really interested in, is like, is there must have been some fascinating stuff that never made it to market, but I assume you got pitches constantly.
Yeah, oh, exactly, and it was fun. I mean, I prefer doing that than being the editor of the next 4 years of Captain America. No offense against Captain America, but I had come back on staff from freelancing for a while. Jim Shooter decided to take me aside, ask me if I would do this special projects job, which I liked. So over the years, it evolved from these licensing partners for comic books, like I just mentioned, these toy companies, to things like Marvel trading cards, which we were enormously successful, working with the National Football League on developing character for them, which was kind of weird, NFL Super Pro.
Oh, I remember.
Oh, you do? You're the one, okay. And so on. But I mean, over the years, like I just did a Marvel retail poster program, so I was in charge of that for many, many years. So it was always fun to work with, really top artists, getting the best work out of them to do a great poster that we could sell through the stores. So that was a regular program for many years. So I don't know if that answered your questions, but some of the other odds and ends that you talked about, I don't get so much involved
A lot
with.
of that stuff I got as a kid, like the TV trays and the Art Adams posters and like.
Yeah, I would hire Art Adams to do something.
Yeah, like getting all that stuff was here in Windsor anyways. We were very close to Detroit, but not a lot of it came over here.
Yeah.
Usually in secondary markets and stuff like that. So it was always, what time period that stuff came out was always a little fuzzy.
In fact, just in the last few days, somebody contacted me on Facebook. The first Marvel trading card series that Marvel produced. Up until then, Marvel, maybe DC also, they would license out something like a trading card set to some trading card company. Would do a real cheapo, awful job on it. The 1990 Marvel Universe trading card set was the first one we did in-house. And it went through the roof, just sold out everywhere. And that's because we hired Marvel writers, Marvel artists, Marvel editors to work on it, and became truly authentic, not just some knockoff that previously it might have been sent out there. But anyway, so somebody contacted me on Facebook just a few days ago. We didn't give credits to the artwork in that first series. We did a subsequent series. So this guy just has made it his mission to identify who drew each card. So myself and a couple of the other people who worked on those cards have been in communication with him over Facebook. He posted all the cards, and I said, okay, so-and-so did this and this and this and this. And I don't remember everything, frankly, but I gave him a lot of good. He's now pretty much filled out within just a few days, like all the art credits for all those cards. Anyway, go ahead.
So, in your initial receipt of the toys and the script, was your reaction like, oh, these toys are great, I can't wait to try and figure something out? Or, I know you didn't like the names, which made sense judging by some of the ones you talked about, but did you kind of look at one, look at the other, and think this is going to be a mess? Or did you have a pretty good idea on how you're going to refine it coming from the
I don't think I walked into it knowing, with any expectations. I just looked at it as, well, I'm being hired to do a job. By that point, I've been working at Marvel in one capacity or another for 7 years. So this wasn't unusual to me. I'd been around enough creative people and done a lot of creative stuff myself to know that, here's a character, come up with a name, come up with a profile. They're just different characters. These guys are robots that turn into vehicles and things. I thought the toys were very clever, but I was also 29 years old at the time, so I wasn't there to play with the toys. I was there to do a job. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but.
Do you have any other, because your little comment about Ratchet being a combination of Nurse Ratchet and Ratchet the Tool, to me that's looking back, his personality, the way he acts, I can see the inspirations and it's really interesting. Did you
remember I wrote these back in the 80s.
Yeah.
I named over 250 of them. So I don't remember each story equally well. You know, some of these characters like pop up and say, oh yeah, I pulled that out of here and I pulled that out of there. But you know, I don't know. I mean, if there's a particular favorite of yours that you want to name, I might be able to you know, bring up some memory about it. If you have any you want to ask me about.
I like Wheeljack a lot.
I think the name Wheeljack, just like Jack of all trades, you know, that sort of suggested somebody who could fix things. I think that was part of his personality. I could be wrong, or maybe I just one flowed into the other. I don't remember exactly. But you know, I tried to come up with names for vehicles that had maybe something to do with the vehicle. So a wheel, a jack, you know, a car. I'll tell you one anecdote. It's kind of a little bit R-rated. So when I was coming up with that initial batch of names, I think it was the initial, might have been the second batch, I don't remember, but I came up with an Autobot name, which I thought was pretty cool. High beams. Cars have high beams. So Allison Shinners, the female product manager at the time of Transformers, said you can't use that name because in Chicago it's slang for something else. That's where she's from. So I don't know if it's slang for something else here in Windsor, Ontario.
It's the same thing.
Same thing. Yeah, so I could not use that name. But, you know, I mean, I was so naive and innocent at the time, I had no idea. You know, but so sometimes I'd run into, you know, things like that. But generally, I just tried to come up with names that the actual toy suggested itself to.
But they let Headmasters go through.
That was their name.
Okay.
I didn't name that one.
Was there a question back there, Andrea?
What's your favorite car?
My favorite car?
Yeah.
I own 2 Priuses right now. I don't know what you mean.
Just any motorized vehicle, because you know Transformers and stuff. Do you have a favorite vehicle?
From the Transformers?
No, just of your own.
In general?
Like a Corvette.
I'm not a car person. I mean, I like driving them to get places, but I don't really dwell on cars too much. But yes.
I was looking at your notes there when you did the slideshow, and you had you were renaming some of the Transformers to your names. What was the reason why you renamed like Mount St Helens to Mount Hillary?
Well, I didn't rename it. That was Jim Shooter. Yeah, he asked me to change it from. Well, Mount St Helens, as some of you might be aware, is a real mountain in Washington State that at that time, right before he wrote that treatment, exploded. You know, it's a volcano, and it was a huge explosion. So, for whatever reason, he decided, well, instead of talking about some reality, he's going to fictionalize it. It became Mount St. Hilary. Yeah, you can call.
I guess 2-part question. You kind of touched on it at the end of your presentation. What was it like working with Hasbro? Did they bring in a lot of ideas? Is it hard to, when working on the comic, did they obviously bring in new characters all the time? Did they have anything else they said, oh, you have to do this, we want you to do this, because it's a toy line?
Well, Hasbro, overall, they were wonderful to work with. It was clear when they introduced a new line of toys and we named them, and then the toys were going to hit the market on, you know, October 1st, and there was going to be commercials on TV and so on, that I needed to bring them into the books. But that was pretty much it. Otherwise, they were like a sponge. Whatever I gave them, they just soaked it up. They were not there to like get in my way. They were really happy with like 98% of what I did. After season 1 of the animation, and the animation went in a completely different direction. I think they took the Transformers off the Earth and to other locations, whatever. And I said, do I have to do that? Do I have to change the comic book to match the animation? They said, well, only if you want to. So I left the comic book the way I liked it, which was on Earth most of the time.
And then, were you still writing the bios and the names while you were writing the comic?
Oh, yeah.
So when you got a new character, would you go, all right, I'm going to write a bio that suits what I can work into a comic?
I wasn't that clever because, you know, basically, I might get a list of like 10 or 20 new characters that they needed, you know, way before the toys get produced, but they have to package it. You have to, you know, put the name on the packaging and the profile. You know, they have to do all of that months and months in advance. And I'm not even up to, you know, planning a comic book about these characters yet. So I would basically just, you know, continue along my way and realize, okay, when I get to 3 months from now, I got to start introducing these characters. I have to start thinking of some stories about them.
And had you finally got around to watching the cartoon yet? Because as I understood it, you'd never seen it.
I've never watched the cartoons.
And Larry Hamm has never seen the G.I. Joe cartoon. He did the comic all through the 80s, 90s. So
yeah, I mean, basically, it wasn't relevant to what I was doing on my, you know, what my relation to the cartoon was, I would produce these names and profiles they'd go to Hasbro. Hasbro would pass them on to Sunbow Productions, which oversaw the production of the animated series. What Sunbow did with them, I have no idea. It didn't really matter to me.
Okay, one more back here.
Oh yes. What is your most focus on? Either the story or the character from Marvel or Transformers?
I'm not sure I quite understand your question.
I mean, either from Marvel or Transformers, what was your most focus on? Is it the story or the characters?
Well, as a writer, the story has to work. So, I mean, you can't you can't do one without the other. You have to have characters who have motivations, who have a backstory of their own, who have a reason for doing what they're doing. So that has to work with the story. But I don't think I could divide it like it's this or that. It's both. Certain characters worked in certain stories. Certain other characters would act completely differently in the same story. So that would make it a different story, obviously. So probably a lot of the stories were generated by, well, this character has this personality and would act this way in this environment. And then where would I go from there? There's a lot of times, if you look at my stories, you'll see I'll take a character, the same fish out of water thing. I'll put him in a forest with some campers. I'll put this character in a used car lot. I'll put this character on a ski slope. I'll put this character in the Grand Canyon. Whatever. So some characters, lent themselves to certain stories in my head, but they all kind of worked hand in hand.
Okay, one last question, Armando.
Just going off of the building characters, did you despise the whole 4-line introduction with each character? Because even as a reader,
Oh, the first issue, you mean?
Yeah, even like
that was,
every first appearance of every character.
Yeah, well, that was a dictate from Jim Shooter. That had to be rewritten heavily. That opening 2-page splash of introducing those characters is very awkward. Bill Mantlo, who was the writer on that, also co-creator of Rocket Raccoon, he hated that. I don't blame him. But on the other hand, you're introducing to. I mean, how old were you when you read that?
Well, I would have been like 17 or 18. But when it
Okay.
came out, yeah,
I was 5.
Okay, he was 5. Okay, so introducing that to younger people, you got to explain who these guys are. You got to say it's not just a bunch of nameless robots. They're and as awkward as it is, it does serve a function.
Did you prefer later on when you got to kind of craft your own story about how characters?
Oh yeah. I mean, I always made sure. I think. I mean, you might be able to find an example or two where I didn't do it. But I always made sure that characters were somehow introduced, like if not the first panel they're in, like the second or third, so the readers can understand who they're reading about. Yeah.
Okay, guys. Unfortunately, I think that is all the time we have. So we'd like to thank you, Bob, for that. It was amazing. So please give it up for Bob. And if you want to talk to him, he's right at the back of the hall there.
Yeah,
Feel
I'd be happy
free
to
to.
answer.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. That was great.
Well, thank you for coming.
All right, thanks,
Thank you
guys.
everybody for coming.